Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to another Archon's Adversaries. Orizus campaign, the defense of Ohai City, the second in our new and improved Adversaries narrative campaigns. Let's get right into a quick recap of what our last video went over. We are on Orizus, a small feudal world on the very northern edge of the realm of Ultramar. And last time we witnessed two battles between the Tau Empire of Borkan Sept and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Here we have a little detail of the Battle of Old Orm and the Battle of Orm Ridge. The Battle of Orm Ridge was a Pyrrhic Tau victory, but it was all that was really necessary, as the light Tau scout force was really just designed to give them a foothold and to make sure that they could actually perform on the planet without getting thrown off immediately. The Battle of Orm Ridge was an effective proof of concept, and while there were too few to actually pursue the mechanicus back to the local Ohai city, it was really a useless tactical mechanicus victory that ended up only saving a few lives overall. As a result of this video, you all lovingly voted, and the much appreciated result has been a good combination of things. Now, when you guys go over votes, I take into account how quickly certain votes come in, where they tend to lie, and then, of course, any comments or details that people ask for. And it looked like the voting overall was quite clear. Both sides received reinforcements relatively quickly, and the entirety of the Planetary Defense Force was mobilized in the defense of their world. So Orizus is alive and awake with the horrors of war. What is the planetary response? Well, there are 4 sections to it. The PDF is marshaled, the Planetary Defense Force, the local defense forces, over 100,000 men total out of their 8.9 million population. Just a tiny bit over 1% of the entire population is armed and ready to fight in defense of their homeland. Now, that's a major activity that takes, honestly, several days in order to even get started with. However, there are standing elements of the PDF that are ready to deploy and get going within only a few hours of notice, and between the retreat to Ohai City and the Battle of Orm Ridge, they certainly have almost 2 days before the Tau could even get close to one of their local settlements, such as Ohai City, which is the nearest to Orm Ridge. The second is that the defense of the capital of Jotun is prioritized. So like I had said before, there are 4 major cities on Orizus. One of them is the capital by name of Jotun. It is about twice the size and quite modern compared to its fellow analog cities. It actually has a spaceport, some orbital defenses, etc. And of course it is the seat of the Imperial government. And as a result, it is prioritized. The lion's share of the marshaled PDF are sent to Jotun just in case the Tau try and leapfrog one of the other cities and go directly for the capital. That is their fear, and as the PDF is under the planet's control and not the AdMech's control, they go for the defensive push to keep the Tau out of their capital. Now the AdMech, of course, protest this. They've been attacked unfairly, and they've suffered severe losses. They've had adepts killed, they've had many Scutari slain, and there's been a brutal assault upon them by what in some cases could be considered forces coerced from the local area. The Mechanicus are absolutely in favor of the entirety of the PDF of Orizus going out and crushing this threat out in the field. Unfortunately, they don't really get their wish, and to a degree, it's to the local PDF's advantage because, of course, this is a feudal world where technology is limited to the 1500s, and there isn't a lot of time to bring up their defense forces to scratch to fight the Tau in open field battle, so they have to rely on their defensive advantage and their numbers advantage. The other cities, the other 3 cities, including Ohai, are given defense forces. Now, these are significantly smaller than the overall PDF numbers, but if you were to break it down by city, there's probably about 20 to 30,000 people given to each group, with the lion's share being reserved for Jotun. The third thing that happens only a couple of days later. The orbital weapons and astropathic alarms are let off of auto-engage. Essentially, this is to deter the presence of the small Tau fleet that are coming to resupply Borkhan Sept's scout group. Now, the orbital weapons on Orizus are pretty much limited to a single Tier 1 broadside macro battery. However, that is enough to frighten off quite a few light escorts, and especially Tau escorts, which are remarkably light and very small. A full broadside weapon like this, of course, gifted to them upon adoption into the Imperial fold, is more than enough to get them to go away, and with the astropath screaming, it definitely lets the Tau know that if you come anywhere near the capital, say to try and orbitally bombard it or to aerially invade it, you are going to be in severe trouble, and we're going to try and blast you out of the sky with orbital weaponry. The last thing that happens is that Imperial and Tau ships clash in a running battle after their troops are deployed. Essentially, the orbital war runs as such. There are initial concerns as the Tau kind of loom over the planet, as the planet itself does not have any orbital defenders other than its own ground-based orbital weaponry. But there is a very quick turnaround as a small Adeptus Mechanicus resupply convoy, including several Imperial escorts and one Adeptus Mechanicus cruiser, arrives, and even though the Tau are able to drop down a large complement of their force, basically a medium-sized army group is deployed with 6 total cadres, the resulting naval battle is more like a running gun battle, where the larger but less weighty Tau fleet of 3 light cruisers and 7 Tau escorts are faced off against the Adeptus Mechanicus cruiser and 2 Imperial escorts. Now, the Adeptus Mechanicus have 3 other ships in this kind of line of battle, but they are civilian freighters. So, that fight is going to be determined at this end of this video and at the start of the next one, but to put it clear, this is not an active running battle where they're going into active combat. It's more that the Tau are being prevented from securing total orbital supremacy by the presence of that AdMech cruiser and those 2 Imperial escorts. So, the forces of Orizus and the AdMech in Ohai City were going into the granular. That orbital war is becoming a drawn-out gun battle, with the Tau ships trying to bait the AdMech and escorts into leaving Orizus' orbital weapons battery cover. Essentially, once the smaller Imperial force leaves the orbital umbrella of Orizus' main city of Jotun, well, they will be vulnerable to the much more numerous Tau vessels, and so the Tau are doing raiding, piracy activities, low-level flying, anything to try and bait the Imperial ships out of their holding pattern above the city. Thus far it has not worked, and it will likely devolve even further depending on how these first few battles go. So, what are the AdMech forces? If you'll remember from our last video, there were not many AdMech forces left after the Battle of Orm Ridge, and so they have had to compromise. Essentially, every single armed individual who was up to battlefield use, who could be scavenged from those patrolling vessels, that cruiser and those 3 freighters that were bringing resupply to the Forge of Anwari, those are all requisitioned as a ground force. Now, our buddy Dosima Respec 99, with his healed hip joint, or at least a relative amount of healing done to his wounded form, is still in charge, even though the rest of Theta 99's excavation squad have been evacuated. Mostly just brought back to the capital as they can't leave at the moment. Now, he still has Hellespont, his kind of burst fire plasma rifle, his Archaeotech plasma rifle, and his power axe, but he is definitely not alone anymore. He has kind of scrounged from the Adeptus Mechanicus ships 200 Navatoi. Now, Navatoi are basically like a void-armored version of Skitarii. They're a little bit more meat than they are mechanical. They are kind of cybernetic in a certain way, much like the Skitarii are, but the big difference is the weapons that they wield and the armor that they're wearing. The Navatoi have void armor primarily, so they're not as heavily armored as the Skitarii, they're not wearing thick, heavy metal plates, and not all of their modifications for their limbs are up to the same grade as Skitarii. So you could consider these kind of bargain bin Skitarii the same way that you could consider naval armsmen to be bargain bin guardsmen. You know, it's an equivalent mentality here, but just to be clear, the 200 Navatoi are not direct equivalents or replacements to the Skitarii, mostly because of their weaponry. They have two different types of weapons. There's the more traditional version, which is a lot of them have shotguns, which are very, very common on almost every Imperial ship of any kind. But the other thing is that about 1 in 3 or 1 in 5 of them are equipped with low-power plasma carbines. Now, these plasma carbines aren't plasma guns or plasma pistols in the kind of traditional sense. They are specifically tweaked to be useful under ship conditions. Now, that effectively means two things. One, their armor penetration is significantly lower. Not zero, but definitely not anywhere close to a standard Imperial plasma gun, and to be honest, they would probably be a lot less powerful than the Tau plasma carbines. Or maybe they might be on par. There's not a lot of detail about the Navatoi overall. But these Navatoi weapons does mean that there are some more modern firearms in this conflict. We're not just going to be talking about 1500s armored cavalry and pike and shot formations. But the Void armor is decidedly sub-Skitarii level, and their low-power plasma carbines and shotguns both have the disadvantage of being relatively short range, unlike many of the better Skitarii weaponry. In addition to that, Dosima Respec manages to grab 70 combat servitors. He basically strips out the combat servitors from every single warship and mechanicus vessel that is available in the local area, and it totals up to around 70 combat servitors. Almost all of them are equipped with shot cannons. Now, shot cannons, if you don't know what they are essentially, imagine a heavy bolter, except instead of firing bolt shells, it fires a small ceramic fragmentation explosive. So, very similar to a fully automatic heavy shotgun. The big difference is that it acts a little bit more like a grenade launcher, firing these fragmenting rounds. Now, there are versions of them that have standard shotgun rounds that just fire something like birdshot or buckshot. But because this is the Mechanicus, and because it's Mechanicus combat servitors, it's much more likely that they'll be equipped with those higher quality ceramic fragmentation shells, which are absolutely vicious and designed for inside of a ship kind of warfare. And those shot cannons will have slightly better range than a regular shotgun, and probably be on par with the low-powered plasma carbines that the Navatoi are toting. Now that's Theta 99's new group under Dosima Respec. Essentially, it's what the AdMech have brought down to defend Ohai City. Now, why are the AdMech down here defending it at all? Why has Dosima gone to all this effort to actually glean any forces? Why isn't he just backing off entirely and saying, let the locals handle it? Well, two reasons. On the one hand, he does actually think, and he isn't necessarily wrong, that there is Archaeotech where he was digging in Old Orm. He genuinely has proof that there is a nuclear reactor buried underneath the ground there. And, above all else, he believes that the Adeptus Mechanicus cannot, at any, for any cost, risk giving up that discovery. He is an Archaeotech Magos, after all, and he believes that this ancient technology could certainly make a massive difference for the value of his relatively small forge. So, for that reason, he is willing to essentially thug it out down here and not go quietly back into the stars and wait for reinforcements or for things to go badly. In addition to that, he's been advocating the entire time that Orizus' PDF should be going out after these enemies, and now he finally has a force of his own that he can use to justify holding certain aims. Essentially, before this point, before that patrol showed up, he was just one tech priest yelling about going out and attacking unknown enemies at the time. Well, not unknown, but at least an unknown number and quantity after the first landing where the Tau had brought in reinforcements. So, not all that listened to so far, but now that he's got some military might behind him, they might be a little bit more willing to listen. Unfortunately, it's a little too late, and he's stuck in the defense. What about Orizus' planetary defense force? There's only about 270 people in the AdMech group. Who's in Orizus' planetary defense force in defense of Ohai City? Well, we have Lord Longwell in command. Lord Longwell is one of those traditional Imperial nobles who both embodies the noble warrior, the leader general, the Lord Commander in a traditional sense, but he is also a noble, traditional in terms of a feudal economy and government, and as a result, he has brought his own command with him. Now, his command is around 2,000 mounted feudal heavy cavalry. Knights, effectively. He has brought silvery, shining armored knights, 2,000 of them, to defend Ohai City. Now, these knights are not just equipped with lances and close combat weapons, no, because of how Orizus is, and because of their value and use of black powder weapons in their PDF, it is actually a very common thing within the PDF that they use matchlocks or some other type of black powder weapon. These knights are equipped with long, heavy lances and pistols, usually 2 per rider, but occasionally 4 or even more per rider, depending on the level of complexity and expense that the noble has. Again, these cavalry are his command. They're not rank-and-file soldiers. They are traditional knights within the society, and that includes lords of fiefs, that includes lords of lands and estates, it includes titled lords, and various leaders who have risen up the ranks via marriage, privilege, position, etc., and thus they are wealthy enough to afford very good weapons and armor. Granted, for the 1500s. This is certainly going to have a different aspect when we come to this much more modern 40k conflict, but keep an eye on Longwell's command. We'll see how he sets them up, because he is a overall commander in this conflict. While he is certainly using and getting along with Dosima Respec a lot better than Dosima is getting along with the planetary government, Lord Longwell is still a lord, and he is certainly not about to let some AdMech tech priest take control of his tens of thousands of men. In addition to his own personal command, what you could consider his House Carls and local nobles, he has brought a 8th Levy Infantry Division with him. Now, the 8th Levy Infantry Division is 30,000 men raised from the local countryside and effectively conscripted. Now, these conscripts are not loyal, and they are not incredibly well equipped. Most of them are equipped with pikes, close combat weapons, spears, and the occasional firearm. Effectively, this defense force being sent out from Jotun City to Ohai City, the 8th Levy Infantry was only at half strength when they started the journey. They have essentially been recruiting, press-ganging, and conscripting every single military-age male between the capital and Ohai City, including many of the residents of the city itself, have either willingly signed on to be part of the 8th Levy Infantry and be armed by the state, or they have been press-ganged and forced into the unit. This has swelled its numbers to 30,000 men. Now again, they're not incredibly well led, they are definitely a buffer force if anything, and their occasional firearms are not going to be much of a comfort in this conflict. But they are not the only infantry group available. The other one is the 11th Regular Orizian Infantry, and this is a solid block of 10,000 veteran men of line of war combat. Now, these formations are a little bit odd. When we think about pike and shot formations in our long ago times, in the 1500s, it was usually a small contingent of shot and a much larger contingent of pike. Now, Orizus has a very different way of doing warfare. Orizus' pike and shot formations are 50-50. For every one pikeman, there is one musketeer, effectively. And the muskets of Orizus are nothing to be sniffed at or laughed at. They are 18mm lead balls traveling at around 550 meters per second. These are brutally vicious weapons that, while not very accurate, are carrying an insane amount of punch behind them. And the men are well trained enough to get off more than 2 shots a minute on a good day with a solid amount of preparation. And believe me, the 11th Regular Infantry are well trained, and they will form the backbone of much of the defense of Ohai City. The final one, and one of the most important elements that are given to the defense, is the 4th Royal Artillery Division. This is around 2,000 men, toting 100 carriage guns. Now, a vast majority of these carriage guns are medium and lightweight cannon. They have a significant range, but very, very dismal accuracy. Most of them are firing unrifled barrels with a significant amount of powder behind them, but with very little considerations for the interaction between the barrel and the ball, and many of these balls, if not necessarily made of iron or banded in iron, are going to be stone balls. So these are specifically guns. They are not mortars, they are not shell lobbers, they're not designed for indirect fire, so they need to be placed in a position where they can actually shoot at the enemy. And believe me, Orizus has that. Ohai City has that. What about Borkan's Sept? What about the Tau? What are they bringing along with them? Well, they have brought the Tiove's first contingent, totaling 6 full cadres of fire warriors and other types of troops. Now, the number for cadres depends on what type of unit we're talking about, but 6 is the overall number that they've come to generally. Now, with the last commander, Shas Vumpaton, too wounded to be in command after losing his eye and losing one of his arms as well, a new commander has been sought from the reinforcement fleet. And that new commander is pictured right here, Suam Orez. Suam Orez is a very, very interesting individual. He's not really a traditional battlefield commander. He is much more of a specialist who's been put in charge of this conflict, mostly because, well, he's quote-unquote earned it. Suam Orez is a stealth suit user with a fusion blaster. He's quite effective as a stealth suit commander, and he's been using crisis suits in conflict zones for a very long time. However, as a stealth suit specific commander, he's not really all that flashy, and a lot of his missions and conflicts up to this point have been individual or with several squads of his own kind. He's not well known for interdisciplinary command, and that kind of begs the question, why then is he in charge of Tiove's first contingent? The reason is, unfortunately, they don't have anyone high enough up in command to take his place. Effectively, he is one of the highest ranking officers left after Vumpaton is knocked out of action. Again, Vumpaton is probably very, very willing to go into conflict anyway, but with his injuries and the time it's going to take him to recover, it simply isn't realistic to let him continue to be in charge, and so they have picked the next in command. Now, the other question is, why isn't there another commander? Well, he's in space, unfortunately. Stuck in space as the orbital conflict is deemed more important than what is expected to be a very easy ground war. Considering that they've defeated what they consider the most important and technologically advanced force on the planet, they think that they're just going to wipe the floor with all of these humans. I almost said Monkai. That is a very unfortunate Freudian slip, my bad. But they think that they're just going to wipe the floor with all these humans, and so they've put someone into command who isn't necessarily all that built for it. He has no experience commanding more than a few squads of his own fellow stealth suit commanders, and he has nowhere near the charismatic or the force of will and personality that Vumbatan does. So this is definitely an officer who is an unknown quantity, a stealth officer, so to speak, one of those ones who disappears when the battle starts and gives you a plan, expects you to follow it, and then perhaps you'll see him afterward. He doesn't really have all that much experience, and we may be seeing the results of some of that when Suam Orez hits the battlefield. The next group is one of the most brutal, vicious, and violent that the Tau have deployed so far. 320 fire warriors, including those who survived the last fight on Orizus at Orm Ridge. Those survivors, many of whom have been wounded, have been healed, and sent back to the battlefield after only a little bit less than a week overall. They have been returned, and they've been joined by 2 other full cadres of their fellow fire warriors. In addition to this, they've been given some mechanical support in the form of 6 devilfish transports. Now, devilfish are equipped with heavy weapons, they are flyers, or at least they're hovercraft of some kind, and they are relatively acceptably armored in terms of 40k armor. Now, again, they are lighter craft because they have to float, but that doesn't mean that they're made of absolute tissue paper. And in addition to all this heavy weapon and fire support, which of course these fire warriors are equipped the same way that the last ones were, most of them have Tau pulse rifles most of them have Tau pulse rifles, and then 1 per squad is going to have a long rifle. Essentially, we'll have a sniper in addition to a spotter drone or a marker light drone. In addition to that, these devilfish have each been given a shield drone. The shield drone is designed to prevent anything particularly damaging and deadly from knocking them out of the conflict, because the Tau, of course, know that they are likely to be outnumbered now that the PDF have deployed, no matter what their numbers are. So, these shield drones are basically linked to the devilfish. They are going to be trying to save their lives by either sacrificing their own or putting up protective shields to try and stop specific threats from damaging the devilfish. In addition to these, the 3 cadres, the big advantage that they have is their strength in their range and accuracy. Over almost every single weapon in theater, the Tau rifle, and especially the Tau longshot rifle and the heavy weapons, will have a massive advantage. They will be more accurate, more capable of hitting enemies at over 100 meters range in some cases. Again, the Tau carbine probably gets cut off much before that, but the rifle, at least, especially with the marker light drones, can more effectively reach out and touch at those ranges. And the long shot can do even better range in many cases. So these snipers are going to be a massive threat against an opponent who really doesn't have the range to threaten them all that much. They can effectively shoot as they like, and if they had the time, they could probably whittle them down on their own, but we'll see what happens. The next thing on the Tau contingent list is 20 BV-25 stealth suits. Now, these are very much like this, the kind of bulbous blue suits. Again, Borkon's Sept, their colors are blue and gray. You'll have to apologize, they don't make a lot of custom Tau art for different septs. But these XV-25s are equipped with burst cannons, so those heavy plasma pulse weapons, and with jetpacks. So they have unparalleled mobility on this field. There is nothing, not even the devilfish, that will be moving as quickly and as stealthily as the stealth suits. There's practically nothing that can reveal them, short of the tech priest himself being able to sight them. So almost every other opponent on this field is going to have to deal with the fact that there is an invisible murderer from the sky jumping around. Now, they also have stealth drones in addition to their natural stealth field within their suit, just to make them that much more difficult to spot. In addition, of course, Commander Suam Orez himself does have his own shield drone, a specific one meant to keep him from getting hit by any abnormal fire that happens to get in his way. So he has a shield drone, the rest of them have stealth drones. He also has an additional stealth drone, naturally. Then the last two Cardras, 150 Kroot, basically the last of what's left on the ships, every single one, no matter how developed, experienced, powerful, or well-armed they happen to be, and 2,000 Gwevesa. Now, we already talked about the Gwevesa last time. They were used quite cruelly and harshly by Vumpaton, and very few of them manages to actually survive the battle, and almost none of his steely-eyed veterans make it out alive. Now, these individuals who are left behind without Vumpaton's leadership are vulnerable. There are problems with them, particularly in their morale. Some of those survivors are suffering from radiation sickness, and it's very difficult to do PR and recruitment campaigns, even if you are the quote-unquote greater good, when your recruitment icons of look at your fellow veteran is coughing up blood and telling you that everything is hell and that you should probably not do what he did. It's quite difficult to get troops when that's your pitch. And the other thing is quote-unquote full equipment. While a lot of the Gwevesa have become experienced enough or capable enough with Tau carbines, there are not nearly enough to go around. However, unlike the previous event where we had most of them equipped with melee weapons, almost all of this 2,000 Gwevesa force are now equipped with some type of ranged weapon. Whether that is the mechanicus weapons that they could salvage and have equipped to them, whether they know how to use them or not, or more of the carbines, or even a few pistols that have been given out to their officers, many more, almost all of the 2,000 Gwevesa in this scenario, have been equipped with at least a ranged weapon, and many more of them than last time have been equipped with body armor of some kind. Usually it is just the breastplate as pictured here, though there are occasional times where you will see one with a helmet. In addition, like last time, many of them are equipped with a melee weapon in addition to their ranged weapon. But I would say still more than half of them are using local ranged weapons, so black powder, muskets, etc. And the last important thing with this group is that the Kroot are putting away many of their rifles. Not only did some of them not have them to begin with, using just close combat weapons, others are simply not going to be equipped with them after all, because a lot of the Gwevesa are requiring simple weapons like the Kroot rifles in order to be effectively deployed. As a result, the Kroot have taken up other arms. In most cases, this is the weapons that were left behind by the Adeptus Mechanicus, radium carbines and galvanic rifles. These weapons are not to the Kroot's strengths. They are quite dangerous anti-infantry weapons, to be sure, but the radiation on them and the complicated ammunition required for them basically limits the Kroot to, once they're out of the first magazine's worth of ammunition, they have to start bludgeoning people to death with the weapons. It's not quite as effective, but the goal was effectively to decrease the Kroot's usefulness in the short term, to increase the deadliness of the much larger group of Gwevesa in the long term by giving them the Kroot's weapons. So the Kroot are at a little bit of a disadvantage here, trading out some of their equipment so that the humans can use it more effectively. However, given the fact that they are Kroot and there are plenty of melee weapons to go around in this conflict, you can expect them to be picking up human weapons quite frequently, even if they're not necessarily sized for their stature. So, speaking of the approach to Ohai City, starting this battle out with the preparations. The PDF have done several things. Castle Longwell in the center of this depiction, a ringed fortress with several elevated walls and towers, has been stocked by the 4th Royal Artillery. All of their 100 plus guns, or all of their 100 guns, have been stashed in the towers or in the courtyard of Castle Longwell, essentially designed to protect it with a fire arc in the southern and eastern edge of the city, where the Tau are expected to attack from, as per the Mechanicus details on where Old Orm and where their transfer was happening in terms of where the landing for the Tau was. So they've set up their defense to be mostly in the south and east. The 11th Regular Division, those veteran pike and shot formations, are taking the southern streets, essentially at each crossroad and at each group of intersections. An infantry group from the Regular Division will be holding it. Now, that's not to say that they're just standing there or forming up into pike squares or shot squares. They are aware that their enemy has the range advantage upon them, and they have reacted accordingly. At each position, two things have been done. One, a large berm or barricade has been set up at the very front, upon which a large pile of earth or a ramp of earth has been assembled. They've had several days to do this, and work crews have been working around the clock to block up these sections of streets. Now, on this large berm, or on this angled kind of barricade, the entirety or a large portion of the pike formations have been stationed, essentially putting all of their spears forward and giving them relative cover. Behind these areas, at roughly 25-meter intervals, 3 trenches have been dug, and these trenches are effectively filled with shot. They are filled with musketeers, whose job it is, once the pikemen are either overthrown or there is some assault made upon them, they will rise fire in sequence, and they will be able to effectively volley fire into the top and front of that berm against any enemy who tries to overcome or blow through the pike formation. Now, that's the Regular Division. They're expected to hold those positions until they are literally killed off of or forced off of them. On the southern streets, what is going on the rest of the city? The Infantry Division, the Regular Division, can only hold so many positions. The 8th Levy Division has become the more important position, and they have covered much more of the city, covering almost every single one of the city squares and the long roads surrounding the entire city other than this one southeastern portion. Now, the 8th Levy have set up a very similar defense, except minus the trenches. They have essentially piled up large, about man-high or higher, barricades of carts, piles of dirt, destroyed pieces of houses, fronting, bricks, whatever it needs to be, to give themselves some cover and to force the enemy to come to them. In addition to that, the 8th Levy Division has started to essentially transfer into urban warfare. They have begun to break open shop fronts, houses, and businesses, and create kind of alleyway communication systems so that they can fight within the city more effectively and not be stuck out on the roads without ranged weapons. So they've already broken into many of the city's houses and made easy ways for them to travel within these urban sprawl areas. Again, this is a 1500 city. Most of the buildings are made out of like wood or wood, plaster, stucco, etc., and they're designed to kind of hold themselves up, which means that a lot of these places are being reinforced and then pushed with more cover, effectively, for the 8th Levy Division. Finally, Longwell's Command. Longwell's Command have been established at the Triangle, which is this northern section, and it is the largest square in the city. It gives him the best sight lines, both northward towards a potential flanking maneuver, and back towards Castle Longwell if he needs to retreat. Now, not only is this just his command, his 2,000 heavy horse cavalry, it also includes some of the mechanicus, essentially a couple of the navitori have been sent with him so that the tech priest can communicate directly with him and help to coordinate fires back to Castle Longwell, but it also includes several hundred of the levy divisions that will help augment and protect his troops from any type of flanking maneuver or urban warfare. He has the lighter infantry troops that he can use to help arrange where his horsemen can charge down the roads. What about the Adeptus Mechanicus? Well, they've picked a much more conservative deployment. They're not in the very thick of things, and they're not spreading out their force whatsoever. It looks like Respec has learned his lesson from last time, and he's not dividing his forces ever again, especially now that his forces are so subnormal. They have entrenched themselves solidly over the last few days at a position called the Iron Cross, or the Iron Cross node, or defense point. This basically includes two small buildings and a complicated trench network across from a four-way intersection of roads. Now, they've had several days to set this up, and they have effectively evicted any locals from the area, essentially being afraid of saboteurs. Turns out they had a very good reason for doing that, as the Tau preparations includes planting saboteurs within outlying buildings to the south and creating multiple spearheads to help prep for command and control of an invasion of Ohai City. Now, this complicated process of planting saboteurs and killing the inhabitants and then prepping command areas has not gone unnoticed, and as a result, a lot of the defenses that originally the Tau saw and that they observed, either with their drones or with their stealth suits, have either been moved around or have been slightly changed or altered, so it's clear to say that the Tau, while not necessarily not knowing what they're going up against, they are certainly at a mild disadvantage in attacking an urban area that is aware that they're coming. No surprises this time, we see the Tau coming. They have vehicles, we have the mechanicus reporting on them from orbital auspex and sensors, and of course we have a tech priest directly speaking with the commander of the PDF and advising him on how to react to the Tau movements. Even if he doesn't understand what the danger is or what the problem is, he at least has respec speaking in his ear effectively and telling him what he should do or giving him advice. So these multiple spearheads are organized and they are set up in a nearby town. Essentially, the marching order or marching formations are organized right before the break of dawn, on basically a week or so, a week and a couple days after the Battle of Orm Ridge. The break of dawn of the Battle of Ohai City begins. At 4 a.m., those saboteurs come a-knocking. Outlying farms turn on Imperial scouts and patrols. Those small groups of PDF troops who had been exploring out to the south and east of the city are turned upon by groups of Kroot in the middle of the night, and they are rapidly torn to shreds or forced to retreat. Errant gunfire, the occasional shout, and certainly the few desperate pike formations that manage to actually assemble themselves are completely wiped out by Kroot and Guavesa forces, as the Fire Warriors quickly move their way into their attack positions to begin their multi-headed spear point assault. By 4:30, the Tau forces are completely ready to go. In 30 minutes, they go from being several miles away with a few saboteurs to being right on the eve of the offensive and ready to move. This hasn't gone unnoticed, though, and the alert of the auspex, not just from the orbital mechanicus vessels, but also from the tech priest's own scouts and from the servitors, have lit up the defenses, and even though it's the early dawn, and we're not necessarily at full light yet, arguably it's still dark, actually, there is fires, there are torches, men are moving out of their positions that they were sleeping in, often right next to the trench line that they're supposed to be holding, and they are rolling themselves into their defensive posture. The PDF is assembled, but the Tau do manage to hit the field first. So there's no surprise here, but that kind of edge that the Tau have from getting into the move first, they manage to approach fairly quickly. However, by 4:45 a.m., the artillery is loaded, and Castle Longwell is ready to respond to anyone who attempts to take the city. The PDF troops are aroused, and with basically 1K infantry in the triple trenches. I've marked them here with the 3 green lines in the circles. You can see this is the regular infantry, regular infantry, regular infantry, regular infantry, and then 3 more positions over here. They are at the heads of roadways. There's around 1,000 of them, roughly, between each of these, and since in total there's around 10,000, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's another 3,000 kind of speckled in there or covering other positions. So, a little bit over 1,000 per position. And then the gangs of 3,000 levies have set up per street. Again, there are 30,000 of these guys spread out amongst the entire city. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 positions with about 3,000 men per position, built into and broken into much of the urban terrain with their own barricades and cover that they've set up in preparation. Now, with these troops all ready to go and the artillery at Longwell Castle already prepping the sight lines and the distances that they've been learning for the last couple of days, the battle begins. Now, at 4:45, the Tau Triple Spearhead becomes finally visible. On the west side, this line here, going through these two command points, we have 2,000 Guavesa warriors and 150 Kroot soldiers. Now, they are making for this roadway. The goal of the Tau is to take Castle Longwell and to break any resistance that might be in the way. The goal here is very simple. It's shock and awe. It's overwhelming firepower, removing anything that might happen to be in their way. And primary to this spearhead is the sheer size of that 2,000 Guavesa force, all equipped with ranged weaponry. And they are going straight up the gut on the west side. Then we have the biggest group of fire warriors, 200 of them, and in addition to that, 4 of the 6 devilfish head in 2 directions. Now, most of the infantry, go towards a blind spot called Bear Street. This position here is Bear Street. It's on the very, very edge of town, and because of Castle Longwell's frontal position, and because of the lack of turrets at the front, it is a blind spot for the artillery as designated by the Tau. So they make the distance fairly easily, and they find themselves kind of inhabiting this block for a short period of time while they wait for the orders to advance. Now, the firefighting hasn't quite started yet, but this is where the first of the fighting is going to start out, because these fire warriors are going to be the closest to their opponents. Now, what about this line here? Well, this is the rest of that main center line group that is going towards the blind spot on Bear Street, and it includes 4 of the devilfish. Those devilfish are essentially plumbing the defenses. They are seeing how the humans are going to respond to heavily armored vehicles going right towards Longwell Castle. Again, they are able to basically float, so they're floating up this street and seeing what occurs and whether or not they have to disembark or change their plan. Again, at this point, the commander has not quite gotten into the fight yet. He's not deployed, for example. He and his stealth suits are not on the field just yet. He's letting the trident make its mark before he decides on a position of strategic importance. And then finally, the last group of fire warriors make hell for leather to go for a full flank. They, unfortunately, are aiming at one of the longest and heaviest routes in terms of enemy fire. They are going far to the east. They are heading out in this direction, aiming for one of the long roadways that goes straight to Castle Longwell. Again, with 2 devilfish transporting their troops, and with an additional 120-ish fire warriors in tow. That's the spearheads. Those are the 3 divisional groups that are heading out to attack. By 4:46, about a minute later, the first combat occurs. The group that heads down Bear Lane as a cadre begins getting into cover and crossing that street. Now, Bear Lane runs parallel to the city, and there is a large group of buildings between this group of infantry and Bear Lane in general. However, this group, this far southern group of 8th Regular Infantry, are in direct conflict with this group of Tau, essentially. Now, Bear Lane is at an oblique angle to this street, and it puts them at a pretty good distance for any musket shot. So, of course, the first fire is going to come from the Tau. However, there is another angle here. These devilfish, which are plumbing the defenses, find themselves stuck between 2 groups. Now, this is this group of infantry and this group of infantry. The result is not really all that unexpected. They start coming under fire by musket and cannon quite quickly. Now, the devilfish do not have to worry. At this range, the cannons are practically missing every other shot, and given that the cannon is spread out quite evenly, there are probably only 10 or 15 guns firing at any one quadrant at the area at one time. However, it is fairly obvious from the beginning that these cannon fire is going to be a problem. Several of the shield drones manage to slow down or blow the balls out of the sky, however, it's still caking the battlefield in dust and blowing up dirt and smoke in the area. What is more, when the devilfish try to deploy their infantry, they find themselves facing up against close quarters combat with a large number of effective infantrymen. These musketeers have laid their defenses quite well, and all of a sudden many of the fire warriors who had been preparing to plunge into the streetways find themselves at a crossfire between this group of infantry and this group of infantry. Now, musket and cannon fire against plasma in the middle of the night. Now, these humans do not have thermals, but what they do have is large watchfires, which they've set in several areas. These are not really designed to illuminate themselves so much as they are designed to obfuscate enemy thermals, and also to provide some light for their shooting at night eyes. This effectively means two things. In the close combat in urban areas between roads, streets, and alleyways, it comes down to a very close knife fighting. The Tau's advantage of their range and accuracy becomes slightly lessened, given the fact that they're fighting at such close range. Now, the devilfish are practically untouched. They suffer a couple of scrapes, a few little minor damages there. Maybe one of the shield drones has been damaged slightly by a cannonball, but it is not really knocked out, simply knocked out of the air, and then is able to be refloated a few minutes later. But all in all, essentially this probing attack that was going in here, parallel to Bear Lane, is not repulsed so much as it is thought better of. And the Tau, instead of trying to push further into this urban area where they are much more at threat of getting collapsed upon by different units, they pull back and decide to posit all of their energies towards pushing through on this section of Bear Road, or Bear Street. Bear Street, or Bear Lane, whatever you'd like to call it, Bear Street becomes this first combat point, and it is one of the more important ones because it sets the pace for how this fight is going to go. On the one hand, the Tau have an absolute advantage in their accuracy and range, which means that effectively their snipers, their marker lights, and even their basic rifles can shoot out enemies that are unable to see them, and in many cases didn't even know that they were being shot at. But that also comes with another downside. There are far fewer Tau than there are enemies just at this position. They are at a ratio of almost 1.5 to 1. Significant there, with around almost 10 to 1, with around 1,000 men here, as opposed to barely 200 here. Now, the devilfish effectively give them cover in this position. Behind each group of floating devilfish, there are dozens of Tau warriors slowly making their way up the street in classic tank fighting formation, with the heavier support weapons of the devilfish blasting apart and spraying down building facades, barricades, cover areas, blasting apart flaming wreckage, etc., and coming under severe fire from what is essentially muskets in many cases. Now, this effectively means that the defenses around Bear Street on one side of it, at least this side, are going to collapse fairly rapidly. This is a brutal efficacy of Tau warfare, where these swift-moving, high-damage attackers are able to push their way into enemy defenses, and even though they are well-laid, well-protected, and well-covered, they're able to simply overcome them because every time you push your head out or angle around a corner, you're getting shot in the face with a plasma bolt. Now, those defenses effectively atomize and collapse, and the Tau are able to get into them only a few minutes later, but it is a few minutes. They do actually have to take some time to get into the defenses for a couple of reasons. One, they're facing a severe difficulty in terms of their devilfish. The devilfish are becoming fairly big magnets for not only artillery fire, but also for massed and harassing musket fire. Now, you might say harassing musket fire, that doesn't make a lot of sense. No, it doesn't, unless you have a very talented enemy against you, and in this case, the regular infantry is definitely one. The regular infantry are going to one of their tried and true methods of getting rid of an enemy in urban combat. The broken open sections of houses and the urban sections of their defense have been plied with several different loaded riflemen who are going up one after another to an aperture or a defense point and then opening fire on a single target. Very often, this is the devilfish. Not to say that they're aiming at the fish themselves, but rather they are shooting at the infantry coming out of the devilfish. These are not protected by shield drones, more often than not, as the shield drones are focusing on the much more dangerous artillery that are getting ever more accurate and ever more dangerous as the opponents crawl closer to them. More and more guns are being brought out into the courtyard or being angled on the walls towards this first contact, and by the end of the first 10 or 15 minutes of the battle, almost 40 guns are pounding this position. Now again, the losses are minimal. Even though musket balls hitting fire warriors are likely to severely wound or damage them, they also have to hit from relatively close range, and they have to get a pretty clean hit. Shots to the chest need to be almost straight on and at less than 75 meters in order to effectively incapacitate or even wound the fire warrior, whereas the fire warrior can simply click anywhere on his opponent's body and they are likely to go down. Even with that, for the couple of hundred, maybe even multiple hundreds, possibly even 300-400 humans that die in the assault on this position, the Tau are able to only absorb not half of their losses, but rather only lose maybe a handful, 2 or 3 squads worth of fire warriors, and most of those are lost to short-range ambushes or to errant artillery fire. A 60-pound ball of lead, stone, and steel is going to kill a fire warrior just as effectively as a las bolt to the face will. Now, this fight at Bear Lane is going to go on, as I said, for a few minutes, but what else is happening at the break of dawn? We have the full insertion of the Tau Trident. These 3 spear tips all hit effectively and begin penetration at around 5 a.m. Now, of course, the Bear Lane fight happens before that with a trading of fire and with the Tau using their ranged advantage upon their enemies, but they have to push into it and get beyond as the urban terrain is forcing them to kind of duck and cover in many cases. Or rather, the enemy is ducking and covering into urban terrain and drawing the Tau onward to the attack. However, by 5:01, severe cannon fire is now ringing out across the field from all quarters. Each tower, each position, the courtyard, and the walls of the castle itself are alight with constant cannon fire now ringing out. Again, like I said, almost half of the position is firing at Bear Lane very quickly within the engagement, within about 15-20 minutes of the actual engagement. But that's not the only position receiving severe fire. The other 60 guns, effectively, are spread out along the wall and firing at various different positions as the Tau begin their assault. The lion's share again is being aimed at Bear Lane, and the result of this is also pretty messy. They are demolishing houses and covering the entirety of the southern field in both gun smoke and in destructive smoke from the destroyed buildings. Now, this is going to interfere a lot more with the humans' accuracy than it is with the Tau, because the Tau have marker drones and also they have their infrared cameras, etc., and their helmets, but it does have some effect on just causing a little bit more chaos of war overall. And what is far more dangerous and problematic to the Tau is that their defensive quarter, their kind of corners and sections of Bear Lane that they have been taking over, are starting to become significantly less effective as cover against enemy artillery, and it is forcing them ever more deeply into the enemy's defenses, which is drawing them into the city quite effectively over time. However, they are not the only ones deploying. By 506 to 530, several things occur on the western front. The Govesa and the Kroot are forced further and further west, as urban fighting with levy troops becomes more and more difficult. Now, what is effectively happening here is they began an assault at this roadway here, and they met a problem. The massive force, over 1,000 regular infantrymen, holding a severely reinforced trench line with a massive barricade and 3 lines of musketeers. Against that is thrown the Kroot and their human allies. Now, it's not to say that they can't overcome that. It's more to say that it's going to take them some time, even more than it did with the Tau, mostly because these Govesa are poorly led, poorly trained, poorly motivated, and don't really know what they're doing with many of their better weaponry. Now, the Kroot can make up for this in some ways, but there are only so many Kroot. There's 150 of them against a force of over 1,000, and they are being swamped by more than 2,000 of their own fellows. Now, this effectively means that while they are grinding through this position, there are a bunch of their own men who are becoming bottlenecked in this street, and having to either try and spill out into urban sprawl, or, more easily, travel along the houses and try to get to another street so they can continue inward. 2 problems with that. On the one hand, there's artillery firing over. So while these Govesa are piling up in the street, they're kind of stacking up on houses or trying to get into cover, they're getting hammered by cannons at this range, in addition to receiving a musket fire from their enemies. Now, this basically means that as they are having more and more of trouble pushing into this position, and they have limited width or bandwidth in terms of combat area that they can go in, you can't force 1,000 men into a hole that only accommodates a few hundred, they are being forced to travel northward and further westward. Each road that they try, however, they are hitting more and more levy militia. Now, these levy militia still have a barricade, but they are also far more numerous, and those advantage of numbers that those humans initially had rapidly deteriorates. It goes from a 1-to-1 fight quickly to a 2-to-1 fight, and then finally to a 3-to-1 fight. Essentially, they are engaging with more and more enemies, and while they are better armed, and in some cases armored than their opponents, they are simply not up to the same level of skill that the Fire Warriors are. And as the Fire Warriors are able to take on 2 of these infantry positions at the same time, with their Devilfish and with higher numbers, the humans and the Govesa are running into more and more enemies. Essentially, moving their point of attack has done the exact opposite of what they wanted. They were hoping to flank the enemy and get into a thinner area. Now they're simply engaging with more and more troops as they're becoming spread out along a wider area, which is making them even more vulnerable to artillery. So things are not going very well here. We have poorly motivated, poorly led, and relatively poorly trained individuals trying their best at a blitz assault when they're at the speed of foot and facing entrenched opponents who are not only using the urban terrain against them, but have the advantage of artillery and numbers. While the Kroot are essentially able to blitz up many of these pikemen, they are also having that same problem of, once their mechanicus weapons are out of ammunition, they're having to manhandle human weapons and use them in their stead. And in many cases, the weapons that they handed over to the Govesa to make them more deadly are simply being wasted or not put to use, as the humans are not nearly as gung-ho to go and get themselves killed once they realize that they're outnumbered and under cannon fire. So, over the subsequent 24 minutes, basically, this battlefield dramatically spreads out on the west, and while the humans and the Kroot are still fighting and making especially good progress at this position here, they have lost large numbers, and they are now engaging with far more enemies than they were initially supposed to because of poor command and control. Again, Our Tau commander has not yet come to the field. In effect, he is far behind this central group, thinking that this is most likely to be his position of penetration, and this group has just barely hit the position. And what is that group doing? At 5:28 a.m., only a few minutes after the start of the fight, 27-ish minutes after the fight starts, the Battle of the Iron Cross defense node begins, which we're going to go into detail on in the next slide. This moving Cardra, the 120 Fire Warriors, and 2 Devilfish make the long, difficult run up to the north. They do a short incursion, and then they hook around and attack the mechanicus defenses. What about after that? Well, by 5:50, something has finally happened on Bear Street, or Bear Lane. The Battle of Bear Street finally goes in the favor of Tau by 5:50. The Force push their way into the inner city, defeating both of these positions under heavy fire. They've been under constant bombardment from now almost 50% of the artillery pieces in the entire citadel for more than 50 minutes. And yeah, it's having a toll, a brutal one, both upon their numbers and upon morale and organization. Now, these Fire Warriors are disciplined and they are more than fearless when faced with a foe, but they are facing impossible odds here. We're talking 100+1 in terms of actual enemies, and many of these enemies are equipped with both vicious melee weapons and ranged weapons that can still effectively cripple a Fire Warrior if they get a good shot off. The chances of getting a good shot off become more and more likely as urban combat becomes more the order of the day. However, both of these infantry units are basically crushed in this victory, and Bear Street, this entire block and section, go under the control of the Tau just before 6 o'clock. Granted, they are in charge of what is essentially a bunch of ruins after all of those cannons have been firing for over an hour, but it is a position that they now hold much better than the Western Front, and, as we're about to see, significantly better than what happens on the Eastern Front. The Battle of the Iron Cross, or the Battle of the Iron Cross Defense Node. Now, as mentioned, this is where the Adeptus Mechanicus had chosen to dig in their own defenses. And the Eastern Column, a full Cardra of Fire Warriors, 120 plus 2 Devilfish, have done the long flank from 5 o'clock to 5:28 a.m., and they have taken it hard. Effectively, as you see here, they have been dragging their happy little asses at artillery range through this countryside for more than half an hour. And they have taken raking fire and long-range fire from not just artillery, but also from musket fire that have snuck up into the urban terrain and fired at them from a distance. Now, this hasn't caused appreciable casualties, but what it has done is it has knocked out several of the shield drones and also several of the marker drones by the time that the East Column reaches the defense node. Now, whether or not the Tau were aware that the Iron Cross defense node was manned by the Mechanicus is unclear. The Mechanicus changing their position was one of those things that was an last-minute defensive change. Initially, the Mechanicus had made every intention of showing up and defending with the rest of the infantry in a more traditional spread-out way. Granted, our lovely Dosima Respec had likely been doing this as a ploy, pretending that he was going to join in with the general defense while preparing his own defensive works at this specific location that he had deemed most advantageous to his troops. And it wasn't for no reason. By 5:30 a.m., 2 minutes after the two forces actually sight each other and begin firing, both forces open up with fire, the Navatoi and the Servitors absolutely hosing down the exposed patrols. These patrols, again, have been trekking under heavy fire, which means that they are in column to the right of their tanks, with the armor taking up most of the artillery and infantry fire, while the infantry hide in their shadow. With that position, and that respecking essentially, the Tau are in line abreast when compared to the Mechanicus, and the first volley from the Navatoi and the Servitors while shorter range and significantly less armor penetrating than possibly even the muskets, is very dangerous, and this hosing down immediately breaks up the Tau formation. Without strong leadership on the field, they assault, become default aggressive, head towards several different defensive positions. Now, the Iron Cross is basically determined by the roadways. There are, again, 4 roads that go through the Iron Cross, and the mechanicus have set up several defense works. One of them is a circular trench work, similar to the one that was used at Orm Ridge that Dosima seems to like so much, and that is filled with both navatoi, and it is protected on the edges by gun servitors with shot cannons. It is also attached to a large building structure, like a small estate effectively, that is also filled with navatoi. Each image here is effectively representing around 25 to 30 navatoi, depending upon the position. But this general area is well held, and it is off towards the external or the northern side of the defense. At the very back of the defense here, you can see a barricade has been placed along the road, and large groups of servitors, basically each servitor group represents around 10 to 13 or 10 to 15 servitors, have been placed across the barricade in front of it, not behind it, but in front of the barricade. They are effectively using their shot cannons like suppressive artillery, firing these fragmenting ceramic shells out in long volleys of automatic fire. And the command suite for Dositma Respec is also back here, where his plasma gun and his own navatoi are set up in this building to defend it. In front of these positions, the first defenses that the Tau actually engage with is a small horseshoe or crescent trench here in the front, which is relatively out in the open compared to the other defensive positions, and there are only navatoi within it. In addition, another exposed position is the primary barricade or the primary breastwork. This is made out of essentially the ruins of a nearby house and several large logs which were moved over the street to try and barricade and protect these infantrymen. There are, again, roughly 20-ish navatoi and a squad of 10 servitors holding this barricade. Now, you can imagine these are not heavy defenses. It's not the huge earthworks that are being raised on the city streets. So the brutal hosing down that the mechanicus get off first is rapidly met by severe fire warrior retaliation. And it is much more accurate and deadly at this longer range than the navatoi are. But that will rapidly change. For example, by 532, the embarked and moving fire warriors make a full-on attritional assault against the first trench line. Essentially, they drop out of their vehicles and they begin a straight-up charge towards this horseshoe trench. Now, it's lightly held by about 25-ish navatoi, but that doesn't mean that it is lightly given up. The devilfish, there being only 2 of them, are absorbing horrific punishment. At this point, they have been hit by hundreds, if not thousands, of fully automatic shots from the shot cannons, artillery rounds, musket rounds of various types, not to mention the low-grade plasma that they are now being blasted with from the navatoi. Again, it's not a heavy armor-piercing weapon, but what is happening is that hundreds of rounds are effectively striking these devilfish as they are being used to cover the Tau fire warriors. They are literally being eaten away at, with every little chink in the armor, every little blast, every little chop taken out of the protection, literally shredding their armor off of these personnel carrier vehicles. Again, they're not tanks. They're not designed to be invulnerable to all weaponry, and while the high explosive rounds are much more effective at showering the fire warriors with shrapnel than they are at damaging the vehicles, there's also air intakes on these vehicles and weapon systems that are getting knocked out as they are shot by hundreds of explosive fragmentation shells. So these devilfish are getting absolutely eaten up, as are many of the fire warriors, but this first trench cannot stand. 120-ish fire warriors absolutely blitz the position, most of them jumping right over the walls and shooting the navatoi at close range, or shooting photon grenades from the few carbines that their officers have in order to baffle their auspex and knock them out at close range. It only takes about 4 minutes of this brutal, close combat assault fighting for the Tau to take the first trench line and the lion's share of their troops to head towards this redoubt. So that circular trench is going to be attacked by basically over 60 fire warriors, while around 30 of them and another 20 head towards the center of the defense. They formed an L-shaped formation. The first trench is overcome about 4 minutes later, and the Devilfish settle to the ground to act as cover and to go hull down. At this point, there have been several fire warriors either injured, put out of action, or in need of protection, and the Devilfish basically sacrifice themselves to make that happen. They drop down onto the ground, keeping their heavy weapons as towards the enemy as they can, and continuing to hose them down with plasma fire, but at this point they've taken enough damage, and they will continue to take enough damage during this fight, that they are at the moment more useful as stationary protection than they are as fighting vehicles. What is also quite problematic is that Dosima's own weapons, his basically burst action, or his burst fire plasma gun, is taking significantly more of a toll on the closest Devilfish than any of the other weapons on the field. So he's able to partially claim a kill here, where his gun is able to knock out one of the Devilfish by melting one of its primary thrusters, which is mainly the idea, or which is one of the main drivers for why they choose to land behind the trench and effectively act as cover. And the result of this is that a small pocket of the Tau are stuck in the middle behind cover. Some of them charge towards the redoubt to try and take it, facing around 50 plus Navatoi and a small squad of combat servitors at close range. And the other forces, what is left of the offensive group that came out of the more injured Devilfish, charge towards the barricade. These split-up forces face various fates. On the one hand, this force here is basically had no ghost of a chance of actually getting in. Their Devilfish made it a little bit further, but after Dosima knocks out its engine, it's forced to crash land effectively next to its fellow to form its protective barrier. That leaves this group of 20 or 30 fire warriors to try and leap the barrier and blitz down these Navatoi. It doesn't go well. At this range, it comes down to sheer numbers, and it's a group of 30 against a group of 70. So, basically, 2-to-1 odds, they're facing severe disadvantages, and it's not long before the mechanicus break and retreat, but it's pointless. With the mechanicus drawing back, both the Navatoi fleeing in one direction and the rest of them fleeing back towards Dosima, the remaining Tau here, who, while they have been successful, are still facing wounds and injuries from their conflict, come up against a firing squad of 30 servitors. At this range, the shot cannons cannot really miss, and if they directly impact the Tau, they manage to crack into their armor before exploding, spraying them with ceramic shrapnel and shredding limbs, weapons, auspex, and various pieces of their war gear. And granted, the Tau are very accurate, and they are effectively able to assault these positions and knock out many of their opponents before the opponents really get a chance to shoot against them. But given that these are mechanicus, cybernetically enhanced cyborg creatures, the Navatoi, and servitors, who are being in many cases directly data-tethered by a tech priest, the difference in their fire rate and, of course, their quick reaction speed is coming down to the wire every time, and if it's a coin flip as to who shoots and kills the other first, well, the attrition of war is very much against the deeply outnumbered Tau. And with their vehicles no longer giving them protection and cover, and many of them being forced to stop and return fire at longer ranges, this spearhead and this section is simply overmanned and overmatched. They never get further than the barricade before they have to pursue and then retreat, getting back to the cover of their vehicles, while this position manages a remarkably unsuccessful charge against the redoubt. Now, it's not exactly clear what occurs on this corner. There is a much larger group of Tau, but it seems indicative of the fact that these Tau are not that well led. They charge directly towards the redoubt, basically ignoring what could be a theoretical gap or weakness in their opponent's lines. They go, instead of for the servitors, for the navatoi, expecting that there's going to be some connection into the house. And while they do make the charge and they make the grade, they don't necessarily get a chance to break into the enemy defenses before this group and this group are either pinned down or forced to retreat. With basically half of their units and their entire mechanized portion knocked out or down via attrition, this group is forced to leave, even though they could have had a chance to break into this defensive work. Essentially, they are aware and understand that if they stay around and they brave any more fire, or they try and attack another separate defensive work with this ragtag, severely damaged Kardra, they will likely lose their lives, and they are much more willing to leave and survive for the greater good, hoping that one of their spearheads will be successful, rather than trying to take the Iron Cross defense node to the death. And the mechanicus, on the other hand, are more than willing to fight to the death. So, it comes down to a battle of wills, and unfortunately, the Tau blink. And the Iron Cross defense node remains in the hands of the mechanicus, and Dosima Respec himself. Now, the losses on both sides are severe. Of the 120 Tau who began this fight, only about 70, many of whom are wounded, managed to survive and limp their way back off the battlefield to rejoin the fight on Bear Street. Both of their vehicles are knocked out, with only one being relatively able to move, but it too is knocked out by artillery fire as it tries to get back to the position. For the mechanicus, almost half of the navatoi are knocked out, a full 100 of them, and of the 70 servitors who began the battle, due to accurate Tau fire, and in many cases use of heavy weaponry against them, only 10 actually survive the battle. So in terms of sheer numbers, the Tau actually give far better than they get, minus the loss of their vehicles. But it is still a victory. And, by the terms of the mechanicus, it is a decisive victory, as they alone, with no assistance from anyone save for the artillery, turn back an entire spearhead by themselves. A heroic victory costing many lives. And this starts the turn of the tide. A much more complex map here as things grow out. Again, by 550, Bear Street and these two constituent positions had been taken. These units of infantry have fully retreated to take up positions outside of the gatehouse to protect the artillery. And the Tau are now free to penetrate as far as they would like into the city. But things are also happening. On the side of the Iron Cross defense node, the spearhead has completely failed, and in many cases they have been outright decimated, number-wise. But on the western side, the Kroot and the Govesa have finally run out of steam. Again, they began their fight at around 5:06, and it is now 5:51. They've been fighting for just under an hour, and they are done. They are out of it. They have penetrated the defenses deeply enough just to get surrounded. Effectively, there's a holding position here, and then as this group gets through on the very diametrical western edge, the opposite of the Iron Cross defense node, they manage to pull through, the Kroot redeploy, and they get finally a bit of momentum going, and then they are outflanked by two separate groups of levies and what is left of the standard infantry from here, cutting them off against the wall on one side, the levies on the other side, and artillery covering their third position. Most of this group is out of steam, out of ammunition, completely unled, and wounded and demoralized. Most of them, even though they've penetrated the defenses, surrender only a few minutes later. Many of them throw down their arms and run away, fleeing. Some others attempt to fight to the death, but are overcome, as they are simply outnumbered and cut into a, unfortunately, surrounded position. This is mostly the result of poor leadership and very poor morale. The Kroot, for the most part, are survivors. They run. And most of them who do run manage to actually survive. So while the humans in this position are basically killed to a man or they desert, the crew to only lose about a little bit over half of their number, with originally the 150 being cut down to about 60 or 65 total, many of them being severely wounded. As they were the head for many of the assaults upon the defended positions, they took significant wounding, not just from musket balls, but also from long-range pike formations that were effectively able to cancel out their great height and capabilities. Getting stabbed over and over again with spears is not a very good way to adapt to life. So, 8 minutes later, right before 6 o'clock, at 5:59 a.m., with their collapse, the collapse of the Govesa and the collapse of Bear Road, Commander Suam Orez finally takes the field in a more meaningful way. He advances the remains of his forces, including the group that had been broken on the Iron Cross, down through this section of the city towards Castle Longwell. Now, his plan, seeing all of the defenses and how they've moved around, how they've organized themselves via both drone and direct communication from the battlefield, he assumes that taking the artillery and taking the castle itself will lead to the surrender of the garrison, and he knows that he needs their surrender. He can't just expect to kill all of them out now that his humans have deserted him, his crew have been vanquished in many cases, and one of his spearheads has failed. He knows that he needs surrender, not defeat. His stealth suits and fire warriors break through the wall. Now, that's not to say that they outright destroy the defensive work. It's more like between the practically invisible stealth suits being able to fly through the urban territory, they are able to decimate what is left of the regular infantry defending the gate. They then jump in a very short time and manage to destroy not just one, not just two, but 3 separate artillery units, unhorsing over 40 guns of the 100 that still existed. Now, between counter-sniping from the Tau, various vehicle weapons, and the firepower that's been occurring on Bear Street, many of the guns have been knocked out, but as they've been redeployed, basically almost half of the artillery regiment is knocked out in a very short period of time, as the stealth suits basically do a bombing run over Castle Longwell, knocking out several different positions in a very short period of time. Now, this is horribly demoralizing, but it is notable that this does not break the PDF. They don't have the swift communication of other forces, and the levies, for example, are often drawn from the local population and have no intention of giving up or losing, even if the castle is taken. So the fire warriors are unable to spread out any faster. They form a defensive position at the gate to Longwell Castle, and they spread out and destroy the rest of the armored division, or the rest of the artillery division that isn't able to flee. So they officially capture the center of the city with around 200 fire warriors and a couple of devilfish left on hand to help hold the position. But they are surrounded by enemies on all sides, and Commander Suam Orez needs a decapitating strike in order to actually defeat these enemies. And so, from the air, from the top of the castle, he looks for one. And at 8:20, he finds it. The resistance is continuing to the commander's frustration, and with the fire warriors holding the castle, his stealth suits finally hone in on the triangle, where Longwell's command, mostly visible by their flags and insignia, and also their cavalry, are observing the battle and being briefed by the mechanicus. This communication is tapped into, and the stealth suits start moving invisibly on their way to try and massacre this command. However, several things go wrong. Again, it's been almost another 40 minutes since the Battle of the Iron Cross, and the Mechanicus have had an opportunity to reassess where their enemies are. Not only have they identified some of the stealth suits, either in the air, or identified that they are stealth suits from the way that fire is just raining from the sky, but they have informed the PDF of this threat. And while they are locating the fire warriors and stamping out the last of the positions that could be potential inroads for the stealth suits, Longwell is aware that he's under threat. So, at 6:30, when the stealth suits and one fully operational devilfish finally fly over the walls and charge at Longwell's command, again, this dotted line from here, they essentially jump, knock out the artillery, go to the castle, knock out artillery, they jump over the wall and make for the triangle and Longwell's command. He identifies them both by the devilfish following them and by the stealth suits, and by the fact that the mechanicus had told him that this is a possibility that could happen, and their charge is met by an equally violent countercharge. Now, the image here is a poignant one, and I have to emphasize it. These stealth suits are again practically invisible, and while they can fly to a limited degree, it's a lot more of a jump pack than a pure jetpack, and allows them to traverse urban terrain and transport themselves fairly easily. So what occurs at the beginning of this fight is that all of these invisible suits and the devilfish drop down to what they believe is the rear of the triangle, assuming that they've caught their enemy entirely off guard. They haven't. What occurs is that many of those light secondaries and some of those mechanicus navigatore that had been seconded to Longwell's command engage with them. Now, they are quickly swept aside. Between Suam Orez's fusion blaster, the various blast plasma weapons on his fellow suits, and the devilfish's heavy support weapon, they're able to make quick work of even these urbanly entrenched infantrymen. What they can't make quick work of, however, is what's coming around the corner. Breast to breast, 2,000 heavy cavalrymen do a death charge about 50 meters around the corner of the triangle. The Tau stealth suits are caught effectively trying to get off the ground. So, as they jump, there is this brutal wave of the countercharge. Plasma meets pistol, lance meets fusion blade, and a vicious fight ensues. Many of the Tau try to take to the air, but specifically the devilfish is knocked out by the combination of navigatore and direct impacts from several lances into its power supply and into its commander's face, specifically. Now, this initial takedown of the devilfish is not the end of the battle by any means. Many of the stealth suits are doing their absolute best, pushing the engines of their suits to stay up in the air and rain down fire on these heavy cavalrymen. And many of them manage to stay there. However, there are a couple of them that are forced to land because, as you can see, they have spent basically their entire day jumping position to position to position, and at this point, they have been flying in the air for well over an hour. And it's been at relative high altitude and firing their guns the entire time, not to mention powering up their stealth suits. Some of them are simply forced to ground by lack of fuel or lack of power. Now, it is of course something that can come back and they try to get off the ground again, but the immediate fighting that occurs upon one of these stealth suits touching dirt is brutal. Many of the knights are unhorsed as their mounts are shot out from under them by plasma. But in the initial charge, two of the stealth suits are simply brought down by a sheer amount of kinetic impacts as 2 or 3 dozen lances are shoved directly into them. Now, Tau body armor is very competent and very good, but once you go down under the heavy hooves of 2,000 horse, you're going to get absolutely trampled, not to mention impaled multiple times by long armor-piercing lances. The pistols are not as effective, but more than once a Tau stealth suit is either knocked or buffeted about as pistol shots manages to shoot several of their stealth drones, and also a couple of them are shot in their boosters or thrusters, knocking them down. Now, as impressive as all of that is, and as desperate as this engagement starts out being, it does not go the way of Longwell's command for long. They knock out 2, then 3, then 4, then 5 of the stealth suits, and beyond that, they're just stuck shaking their fists at the sky as plasma rains down upon them. However, there are 2,000 of them, and there are limitations in how quickly the Tau weapons can fire accurately. So, As the Tau are continually jumping in and out of cover, making their way through urban terrain, the rest of the battlefield collapses in on their position. Longwell's command, of course, being bolstered by the levies in the local area, and the fire warriors facing more and more organized infantry units that are retreating back along the road to try and root them out of their rudimentary protection of the keep. Now, Longwell Castle is a defensive work, and they are not necessarily directly inside of it, which makes it quite difficult to hold the road, but eventually they are forced back inside, and to not be surrounded, they effect a breakout. But that is only after both of the forces in the north grind each other into dust. Lance meets suit, power runs low, plasma atomizes men and horses, and of the 2,000 men of Longwell's command who were considered heavy horse, less than a dozen actually survive the engagement, with Longwell himself not being among them. However, the commander of the PDF is slain, Suam Orez is also slain. Now, the Tau commander, needing this victory and needing his foes to be completely broken, does land. Not necessarily because he happens to be out of fuel, which just happens to be a happy coincidence. It's also due to the fact that he believes that himself being visible and forcing the enemy to take him on directly is going to break their will and morale. Unfortunately, he dramatically underestimates the Knights of Ohai City, and a large group of armed lance knights manage to ride down Suam as he tries to jump back out of combat and impale him several times through the back vents of his armor, finally killing him as he pulls away from the group and he bleeds out in an alleyway. Now, with their commander dead, with their forces surrounded, and with no real easy way, it seems, to force these humans to retreat and capitulate, with most of their command being already dead and them still continuing to fight somehow, simply because they have the numbers in many cases, and in some cases because they have no idea that their commanders are dead. It's very much not a visible conflict to these infantrymen in the front, and they have their own commanders and orders. So eventually, the Tau, especially the stealth suits, are forced to back out, stealth again, crawl back away from the battlefield, with about half of their number in total surviving the engagement. And for the Fire Warriors, the 200 that started the defense of Castle Longwell as a rear guard, roughly 150 of them managed to make it out of the city, many of them severely wounded, and almost all of them completely out of ammunition. And the result, well, the Battle of the Trident, or the defense of Ohai City, is a razor-close, thin Imperial victory, mostly saved because of the nature of the PDF and the bravery and sacrifice of Longwell's command. This heavy horse cavalry, very willing to give their lives in the search of destroying these foreign invaders, could very well be what changed the tide of the conflict, in addition to the smaller but equally important Battle of the Iron Cross defense node, which, in the eyes of the mechanicus, and arguably in the eyes of Imperial historians, was a decisive mechanicus victory, where they managed to shut down an entire Tau spearhead by themselves and suffer relatively medium casualties. Overall, it is a close Imperial victory. The force destruction on both sides is brutal. Of the 320 Fire Warriors, as I said, only about 150 of them, many heavily wounded, survive the battle. Not a single Guavesa survives the battle to tell the tale who did not desert at some point during the conflict. Of the Kroots, only around 60 to 70 are still capable of fighting after the conflict, many of them dead, others simply too wounded to continue, and are cannibalized by their fellows. Of the Devilfish, only 2 are managed to survive the conflict, with most being knocked out by a combination of close quarters engagement, such as being boarded, or by artillery in many cases, or the Adeptus Mechanicus, knocking out 2 of them on their own. And finally, Shusan, Orez, and his stealth suits. 10 of them are totally slain, either by artillery in some small cases, or mostly by the absolute destruction of Longwell's command. Longwell's command is basically slaughtered to a man. They have only a dozen nobles and knights left after the conflict, many of whom are so badly injured that they will die after the engagement. The rest of his force is mostly obliterated. Of the levies, they had begun with 30,000, only about 12,000 survived the engagement, many of whom are again so severely wounded that they will die later. Of the original infantrymen, of the 10,000 of the 8th Regular Infantry, of the 11th Regular Infantry, there are a total of 5,000 left. They had taken gutting casualties, with 3 of their positions basically ground into pulp, and another one so severely wounded that it needed to be double reinforced by levy troops in order to survive. So it has been brutally close, and if there had been more connection, more communication, or better leadership on the side of the Tau, it could certainly have gone their way. Unfortunately, the cards were simply not there. So, what happens next? You will have several options in the vote that comes up soon. There's the option to include new forces in this, a final effort on the side of both forces, or we can go with something else. This is going to be one of the things where I want you guys to give me ideas for how to finish this out, or how to add some more flavor and continue it. We've had one that went the way of the Tau, one that went the way of the Imperium, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of disagreements as to how this has gone, and that's perfectly fine. There are lots of things that we can talk about, and of course, the other thing is, today we also have a vote for our next engagement, for our next campaign that we're starting, so lots of things to vote on. A couple of additional notes just to frame what happens after these battles. The local traders are rooted out. The Tau tech, often this is things like relief rations, pamphlets, material, are used to identify traitors. Essentially, anyone who the Tau interacted with and left any evidence of their interaction behind, they are slaughtered by the local PDF. Many civilians, serfs, military-age males, older people, does not matter. They are essentially culled to a man. Anyone who had visible connections to the Tau in any way in the local area because of a threat of saboteurs are slain. There will be very little or no local cooperation with the Tau unless they choose to go further afield or go underground and start recruiting for a much longer period of time. This is definitely a war crime. We are definitely talking about killing random civilians who might have gotten relief rations from the Tau, but it's the Imperium. What do you expect? The second part is that the orbital conflict has yet to be decided. The entire Battle of Ohai City only lasts a couple of hours, from about 4 in the morning to around 7-ish, by the time that everything is said and done. But the Tau are not bloody, or they're not beaten just yet. They are bloodied. They've lost one commander, and they've had another one severely injured. They've lost a lot of fire warriors. They've caused absolute oceans of blood to be spilled, but how many support assets do they still have left in their small fleet? Do they double down? Is their orbital conflict going to make so much of a difference that they're willing to drop down onto the planet and give it their absolute all? Are they going to try and evacuate the troops that they already have on the planet? What's going to happen? They're still able to thug it out and beat it out, and of course they can also fall back on some more classic tactics, but this has been a very painful defeat. So, I would love to see what you guys want to see next. We have, as I said, a lot going on. Many materials in this are going to be disagreeable. Again, this is an adversary series. We got to put some play in it. Things got to go back and forth. I really wanted to do a lot of funny things with this, and you can see the pike and shot versus Tau mentality definitely coming out. But I hope that it has been satisfactory, or at least enjoying to listen to, and I wish you all a lovely good night. Don't forget, comment, vote, subscribe.